This is a part 3 of my Season 1 analysis of the original generation of Star Trek. In this particular case, what I'm attempting to do is, using information in the first season, is to determine how big the Federation actually is. As with the speeds of warp and impulse, it's impossible to determine this with any real accuracy, but we can get an idea of what feasible size is required in order to make the episodes work. In the first season, we are introduced to a number of different planet types. As you can see from this list, the most numerous are human colony planets. We also see 11 human planets which are not colonies and at least 4 alien planets which are part of the Federation. Other sources claims there are 700 colony planets, or perhaps systems, and 150 member planets in the Federation. Based on the above ratio, there are probably another 150 human mining, farming, research and starbase planets as well. These do not have to have a large population, although the starbase planet probably would. All these planets are inhabited in some manner. The next question we need to ask is, what kind of density of systems would we be expecting? If the Enterprise travels for 2 weeks in each episode and averages 400 times light speed, it could travel 15 light years. If it went faster, this could move up to 30 light years, which is probably more reasonable. If we assume it reaches one planet each episode, then the average distance between systems would be around 30 light years. This is much greater than my earlier estimate, but once I discovered the Federation could span 1800 by 1800 by 1000 light years, I needed a reduced density. Based on this distance, the area a system occupies is about 27,000 square light years. If we're dealing with 100 systems, and I want to emphasize I'm mainly talking about systems, so I'm assuming all the information that I've received so far referred to systems. So Alpha Centauri, where we know there must be possibly up to 4 colony planets, is regarded as a single system. Okay, the Federation needs to be at least 270 million square light years in volume. This gives us a Federation which spans 200 light years in all direction from Earth. This is too small, so we have to assume the planetary density is not uniform, and the distance in Squire of Gothos, for example, is actually 450 light years and not 900 light years. Basically what I'm saying is that the evidence we have is the Federation could span 900 light years. This can't be the case, so we need to bring it down to 450, which is still double the size that we've just estimated based on our density calculations. So I have to assume there are big gaps in the Federation, which brings it back up to about, let's say, 450 light years in all directions from Earth on average. The probable size of the Federation in 2264 is, as a result, 400 to 450 light years radius from Earth on average. Obviously, some planets will stick out and there'll be some that go inwards, so it's not going to be an even sphere, but nonetheless this gives us a rough or solid idea of the kind of size that we should be considering for the original generation. Obviously, any expansion in the direction of the Romulans has stopped, so the border of the Federation will not be uniform for that reason alone, if not others. This is required to avoid the system density being far too low. The border is marked by the neutral zone, and we do have a map of the neutral zone, but we are unaware of the scale of the map. There must also be a border with the Klingons, where any expansion also has stopped, although the expansion there probably has stopped by the end of Season 1, so wouldn't affect the Federation at least up until that point. The map we possess does not have a scale, but we see 2 Romulan systems close to each other. If this is 30 light years as per our average, then each square represents a 30 light year square. The neutral zone shown would be 300 light years in length and about 30 light years in width. Romulus is within 120 light years of the neutral zone, which seems rather close. As we know, the Enterprise came up from the lower edge and Earth is certainly not in the map. This indicates the Earth Federation is much larger than the Romulan Star Empire. There is only one explanation for Romulus being so close to the neutral zone, and that is the Romulans were losing the war and thus lost territory. We are moving into wild guess territory now, but this could be a reasonable view of the border between the Romulans and Federation. I created the Romulan sphere based on the neutral zone, basically created a sphere based on it. This may not be correct. The Enterprise may have been moving from a position closer to Earth when it got the message of the attack. In this map, Romulus is not in the centre, so the Star Empire may have been bigger and Earth pushed them back, which is most likely. This would allow the Romulan Star Empire to be larger than shown here, which, as I indicated, is actually a lot more likely. Now this is actually the more likely scenario. The yellow line represents the start position before the war. Both sides would be equal in strength. The areas controlled would have been smaller before the war. In this scenario, both sides occupy 400 light years in all directions from their capital planet, or half, but in 2260 this would have been half, or 200 light years in all directions. Earth pushed the border back into Romulan territory when the war ended. This makes sense, as the Romulans would probably only make peace if it was losing, and the humans would have been a looser confederation which would have been happy with the extra systems under its control, thus would have also accepted peace. This also explains why the neutral zone is so close to Romulus and so far away from Earth. If this is correct, it becomes obvious the Federation-Klingon border must be on the top or bottom of the map. I feel the Klingons and Romulans must have a border, so as I have a theory the Klingons were an ally in a war with the Romulans, and that this is the reason why Earth was able to hold back the Romulans and possibly take Romulan systems. It's a wild theory, and there are other theories to explain this, but nonetheless, other sites that I've looked at kind of back this up in terms of the position of the Klingons. The the top of the map is logical position, but when I looked at the internet, in most cases the Klingons were below the Romulans, so the logical position as a result is the bottom of this map. I really have no idea where the Vulcans would be placed on this map. They would need to be far away from the Romulans, otherwise they would have discovered they were related before the Terrans did or the Earthlings did. The best position as a result is probably on the other side of Earth, at least 200 light years away. You may now ask, what about the third dimension, north-south or up-down? The galaxy is only 1,000 light years deep on average, so while the various nations may be centred on slightly different planes, they could not be above or below each other to any large extent, or at all. We know Earth sent a ship to the North Galactic Barrier, or at least the North is the closest galactic border, so that's where it was logical to be sent. Thus there was no one north of Earth, and Earth is in the centre, or it's actually very close to the centre at the present moment, having crossed the centre in the early 2010s. If the Romulans were below Earth, they would not have enough space to create a star empire, 400 or 800 light years across. Once we start moving into sizes of 800 light years, we actually move into a purely two-dimensional world. Earth is probably somewhere around the position of the arrow, and while it looks thicker, the useful galaxy is still only 1,000 light years thick. Beyond that, the systems are very apart, and beyond the protection of the galactic magnetic field, not a very healthy place to live at all. This is a map from a SPI board game. In this case, each hex represents 1,000 light years. It's not possible to see Sol, but it's on the left and in the centre. The interesting point about this map is the galaxy is about 1,000 light years thick at the point Sol occupies, which means there is no depth in this map. If the Federation extends 400 light years in all directions from Earth, it would just take up, or almost take up, a full hex. If we zoom in on this map, this shows the galaxy around Sol. The density of stars in each 1,000 square light year hex is shown, with gold being the highest, silver the next, and black representing a low star density. Sol is close to an edge of the Cygnus-Carina arm, so it's likely the Romulans occupy the gold hex to the left, the upper one, and the Klingons occupy the lower hex. This is such a wild guess as to have probably no value, but represents a viable attempt to determine where the Federation exists in the real galaxy based on the small bits of evidence that we have in at least the first season of the original series of Star Trek. In the next generation, the Federation is supposed to be 18,000 light years across when it was formed, which would represent 18 hexes. Unless warp speed is a lot faster than I've estimated, this is very unlikely. A more viable estimate is 180 light years in all directions from Earth, but even that seems a little bit small. But probably, actually in retrospect, it's probably about right. I think the Federation was formed after the Earth-Romulan War. I think the Earth Empire was about 200 light years in all directions. So, this is probably in the ballpark. So I think in the next generation, they were out by several orders of magnitude. There are about 250 billion stars in the galaxy. This gives us a density of about 40,000 square light years per star. As the density of stars around Sol is closer to 1,000 square light years per star, there is a lot of empty space in the galaxy. This explains the low density black hexes in the map, where system density is very low. I don't know what the difference is, but I would suspect it's an order of magnitude lower. There are 52 systems within 16.3 light years of Sol. 50 are red dwarfs and the rest are larger suns, such as our own. There are also 4 white dwarfs and 4 brown dwarfs that we know of. If our Federation of about 1,000 systems spans 400 light years in all directions from Earth, then there are 63,000 systems which are not occupied by the Federation. If we only look at the larger suns, there are only 9,000 systems which are not occupied by the Federation. I suppose if the Federation only occupied planets which are habitable, then it's possible only 1 in 6 systems have habitable planets. But if anyone ever decides to go down the path of terraforming, there are absolutely no lack of suitable systems. You could achieve an enormous density if you wanted to try and do this. Using all the guesswork that we've done so far, this probably represents the Earth and Romulan Star Empire territories at the beginning of the war. When Earth went to war with the Romulans, the overwhelming bulk of their military power would be in Sol, and the rest would mainly be in Alpha Centauri. The rest of the planets would represent very little military potential apart from defence. I would assume the same would apply with the Romulans, who would have Romulus, Remus and Romi against Earth, Mars, and Alpha Centauri. This probably represents the final border between the two territories at the end of the war, based on the map that we have. It's possible when the Federation was formed, the blue sphere would have grown. However, it's likely that apart from the Vulcans, there were few non-human planets in the Federation at this point in time. If the Federation resulted in a significantly more powerful enemy, the Romulans would have been totally outmatched and they would have never tried to provoke the Federation 100 years later. So it's actually unlikely that when the Federation was formed, the Federation got a big power boost. The only way that this is possible is if during the Romulan-Earth War, Earth actually had the support of the Klingons. So as a result, it could have won the war without being overwhelmingly larger. And then later, of course, the Klingons were no longer friends, and the Earth had to get lots of other alien planets into the Federation to match the Romulans. That's theory 2, and the theory 2 is a real wild card. I think if you want to go based on probability, the probability is that the Federation in 2150, apart from the Vulcans, was almost exclusively Earth, and when the Federation was formed and expanded, it didn't really get a big boost in economic and military power. The only wild card really is the mysterious aliens mentioned in the Balance of Terror. And of course the allies could have been the Klingons, which is theory 2, but you know what, it's more likely that the allies were the Vulcans. If we project forward to 2260, assuming both empires continue to expand as they had in the previous, this probably represents the border in 2260. If this is correct, there is a big difference between the Federation and the Romulan Star Empire. We also need to ask ourselves, could the Romulans have expanded further out away from the Terrans to make up for the loss of territory? We'll discuss this in a moment. In Errant of Mercy, the Federation and Klingons go to war. As it turns out, apart from a small skirmish with the Enterprise, there was no combat as the Organians stopped the war. While there was no war, we have a few clues which may allow us to position the Klingon Empire. The first point is most later sources state the Klingons and Romulans have a border. This means the Klingons must be forward or in the rear of the Romulans, with a small border with the Federation. Most of the later source maps have the Klingons in the galactic rear position. The galaxy rotates in a clockwise direction using the top-bottom orientation, I'm assuming. If you reverse the orientation, or look at it from the bottom up, the direction is anti-clockwise. I'm using the direction the arms trail as my guide in my maps, and that determines my top and bottom position. As a result, we get a rough idea of where the Klingons sit. Converting it to our map that we showed earlier, you can see that the Klingons probably sit at the bottom. The space between the Federation and Klingons was a type of neutral void with only one Class M planet in it. This tells us both spheres were only just touching each other in 2264. It's possible the Klingons may be closer to the Romulans and may have even taken some territory in some kind of minor skirmish. There is no proof this occurred, but may explain why they do not get on together and ally to defeat the Federation. There is a high probability the Klingons and Federation fought a limited war sometime before 2264. Most likely it was after 2245, but for our exercise I will assume it's in 2245. I'll need to account for this somehow, but this was likely a Klingon subject nation attacking a Federation allied system, which later became part of the Federation. Both sides probably tried to limit the war, and the closest analogy would be the North Korean invasion of South Korea, the involvement of the UN forces, and then China's involvement, which in Star Trek universe would have been the Klingon forces. Because the fighting was between client or allied systems, it would not be in the respective Federation or Klingon spheres, but was probably close to the Federation border. This could have occurred on either side of the Organians, well beyond any void. Let's look at the galaxy on its side. All three home planets of the Federation, Klingons and Romulans would have been on a similar plane within the galaxy. There may have been some variation, perhaps no more than 100 light years, but within that variation it would have been similar. The reason is any system in the centre plane of the galactic arm would be able to expand in all directions and have a major advantage over a system that was not. Earth is 10 to 20 light years north of the galactic plane, so the other two home planets of the other empires, Klingon and Romulans, must be similar, otherwise they would be at a disadvantage. It's entirely possible the Romulans and Klingons did have a disadvantage, which is why the Federation is so economically powerful. But as they are on the edge of their arm and already possess a significant disadvantage compared with Earth, I'm assuming they must be on a similar plane, otherwise they would be completely outmatched. How deep should this plane be? Probably 100 light years. If you start going further north or further south, you start getting into some difficulties in terms of expansion, although this probably wouldn't have been noticed by 2150. It would only be really noticeable in 2260. So this gap in between could be actually as wide as 300 or 400 light years, but all three planets would generally sit in a similar plane in this sort of zone. This would be the position of the three empires at the start of the Earth-Romulan War, which explains why the Klingons were probably not involved, even though I have a theory they may have been. This pretty much kills the theory the Klingons were somehow involved in the Earth-Romulan War. Instead, there may have instead been some minor skirmishing between 2245 and 2264 between the Klingons and Romulans, and that may actually be the extent of the conflict between those two empires. This would have kept them from joining up with the Federation. You know, everything here is wild guesswork, but if true, we could make an estimate of the size of the Federation when warp drive was first invented. We know Earth had colonies on Alpha Centauri when warp was invented, and had sent exploration ships out as far as 400 light years away. It seems reasonable the size of the Earth Empire was perhaps 50 light years in all directions from Earth in 2060. The key technology is impulse drive. Once Earth had created impulse drive, they would have quickly expanded in all directions. A sphere 50 light years in all direction from Earth would give the Earth 15 systems based on our Federation density. At least 5 would be mining or farming systems, giving us a total of 10 systems. If impulse drive was invented in 2050, then the Earth would have had 10 years to colonise 10 systems. None would be more than a simple farming colony planet, apart from perhaps Alpha Centauri. We must be reminded that the Star Trek universe, as envisaged in 1966, is not our universe or our timeline. We can assume history is correct up to 1966, but beyond that we are in a different universe. Perhaps we could stretch it to 69. Considering all the meddling which occurred in around 1960 by the Enterprise, I'm not surprised the timelines have diverged. The 2 trips back by the Enterprise probably created a new timeline each, and if Kirk did not lose his girlfriend, a major timeline change back in the, would have occurred back in the 1930s. Time travel is dangerous and needs to be avoided at all cost. Going back to this early period, let's look at all the 3 expanding races: the humans, Romulans and Klingons. Most other races have only their home planet, or at most a few colony worlds. The Vulcans are unique. They have logic and have determined that unsustainable expansion has no benefit, or perhaps their birth rate is very low, or as we later discover, their unusual mating rituals or process makes it very difficult for them to have colony planets. The other races could be technologically behind the 3 leading races and would have expanded if the humans, Klingons and Romulans were not there first. The only exception is the First Federation, but this seems to be a small collection of systems which have remained reasonably stable. They're also way up, possibly in the north of the galactic plane, and thus greatly constrained in their ability to expand. The real wild card is we have 3 races all expanding at a similar rate, both in time of economic power and technology. The Federation becomes economically more powerful than the Klingons because the humans managed to get a bunch of other races to join it in 2160, especially the Vulcans, but apart from this, they are probably similar in total power to each other 2 races. In terms of probability, the situation is very unlikely. It's not impossible, very unlikely, but of course for the purpose of the TV program, we need lots of even forces to be battling against each other, otherwise we wouldn't get the excitement in our episodes. If we assume all planets start expanding at the same time, then there is a reason why the humans became more powerful, at least economically, or there must be a reason. The easiest explanation is the humans either started expanding earlier or expanding into more economically valuable territory. The latter is the best explanation, but the former is not impossible. I will go with the high density of suitable sun theory, which is reasonable considering the position of all the home planets that I've currently derived. To compensate for their economic weakness, both Romulans and Klingons focus more on military power, which is a viable strategy if they feel they are facing an economically more powerful nation which stands in their way of it and nice juicy systems and resources. This is a very late map of the Federation I got from the internet, and thanks for the person who created it. Apart from the Cardassians, which do not exist in the original series, this is similar to my estimate. This is a good map if we exclude the Cardassian Union. Just a quick note, I keep on saying how Earth has the ability to expand in higher density systems, etc. Now, if you remember earlier in this video, I showed you a map that had gold, silver and black areas. Now, if you looked at where the Federation resided, it was smack bang in the middle of nice juicy gold area, while the poor old Klingons and Romulans needed to actually go in the direction of the Federation in order to get nice gold juicy areas. They had a lower density of planets. Now again, this map that you see here seems to basically show that out. The Klingon and Romulan star empires seem to have lots less planets. Now this could simply be that we don't know all the planets in the Romulan star empire or the Klingon empire, but it does kind of align with the theory that Earth, being very fortunate, being in the centre of the galactic plane and smack bang in the middle of nice high density gold zones in the spiral arm, has a big advantage over the poor old Romulans and Klingons. And so part 3 of my analysis of the first season of the Star Trek original series is complete. Live long and prosper, fellow Trekkies.